Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Dr. Paul is away today, so I'll be handling some of the duties, and thankfully I have an old friend and great expert on foreign affairs to join me to help me understand some of these things that are going on. Phil Giraldi, many of our viewers will recognize him from being on the show many times. Many others will recognize him for his frequent speeches at the Ron Paul Institute conferences. Phil was a former CIA officer. He is now the director of the Council for the National Interest in Washington. Phil, are you there?
I'm here, Dan. Thank you.
All right, it's great to have you back. We've gotten in such, there's been so much happening over the year. We hardly ever get to have our friends on. We're always overpacked with stuff. But today we want to talk a little bit about something I know this concerns you, Phil, and it's concerned me a lot and a lot of people, and that is the seeming almost sort of drunken careening toward a major conflict with Russia over Ukraine. And setting the scene for the reason we're discussing it today was that yesterday, yet again, Congress has to sort of do a Me Too. You know, the Biden administration has been, fanning the flames, but Congress says, hey, what about us? And so the Senate Foreign Relations Committee yesterday passed an authorization for $300 million in military aid to Ukraine each year. And that'll include several million to train their officers. Senator Menendez, who we know is a big neocon, he cited the massive Russian troop buildup along its eastern border and aggression in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. Well, those Russians, how dare they stay within their border with their troops? But the massive troop, the aggression was really a military exercise that the Russians were conducting around Crimea, and that has ended. I guess it's good that we don't do exercises. But Phil, I wanted to start by giving you a multiple choice question. I'm going to put you on the hot seat. Because I was thinking about what is the origin of this sort of current state that we're in, where, a couple of weeks ago, I don't feel as nervous, but a couple of weeks ago I thought I was going to wake up in the morning and hear, some horrible news. But here's a multiple choice question. What is the origin of the most recent break, this most recent escalation between the U.S. and Russia? A, Biden's election full stop. B, Biden and Nuland and crew rejoining their old seats in a higher capacity than last time. C, the March 16th interview with Biden where he agreed that Putin is a killer. D, the March 24th presidential decree by Zelensky, which he said it is the policy of Ukraine to take back Crimea by force. E, there's a lot of choices here. The U.S. administration's, quote, unwavering support statement, and that was Austin, the defense secretary, and that sort of thing. E, none of the above, or all of the above. What is your choice, Phil?
Well, I hate to waffle, but I think I'd have to say all of the above, and plus I would add another one. I would say that there's in the DNA of the Democratic Party, there's the remaining sting about the 2016 election, that essentially the Democrats have not let loose of that idea and of Russiagate as a threat to the United States. And I think that it serves a couple purposes. It first of all legitimizes the foreign policy that the Democrats are going to pursue anyway, and to a certain extent, it creates an enemy. I think it's important for the United States, the way it's been since 9/11, since the global war on terror, to have an enemy, because that justifies expenditures, it justifies violations of the Constitution, it justifies creation of a executive-friendly police state, basically, in the United States, a totalitarian drift. It justifies a lot of things, and I think that it's convenient to look at the Democrats for this, but the Republicans are into it too. And you're quite right. There are heroes like Rand Paul and Tulsi Gabbard once upon a time, and Massey, but they're very few. And these are people who take a longer view of what is going on in the world and say, well, really, what is the United States' interest in staying there? And of course, there isn't one.
Yeah, well, I like the way you frame that, because I've read several of decent experts talk about a lot of this is for domestic consumption. I think there's a mindset in the U.S. We have sort of a messiah complex, we feel that we're somehow God's chosen people to reorder the world or something like this. There's something in the DNA, and I think that's the right thing to use. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was President Putin's recent State of the Union message. And there are a couple of things in there that stood out, I think. And there's a couple of quotes. He talked about, and I'm going to ask you about this a little bit later on its own, but he talked about the reported attempted coup on Belarus, where the president and his family were supposedly said to be, they were going to be killed. It was broken up by the Russian intelligence. That's the claim. But here's what Putin said in his speech. He said, listen, whatever you think about Yanukovych or Maduro, et cetera, whatever you think about Lukashenko, he said, but the practice of staging coups d'etat and planning political assassinations, including those of high-ranking officials, well, this goes too far. This is beyond any limits. And then he went on later to say something that I thought was very interesting. He said, he talked about crossing red lines. He said, I hope no one will think about crossing our red line with regard to Russia. We ourselves will determine in each specific case where it will be drawn. So the question I'm wondering, and I've been thinking about this a lot, to me it seems with this and with Russia's reaction to this latest heating up of tensions, this doesn't seem like the Russia we saw in 2014, which did a few things but essentially rolled over while Ukraine was stolen away by a U.S.-backed coup. What is your take on that assessment?
Well, I think that Putin was very, as you say, very much concerned with laying out very clear, very simple red lines about where he would go or not go. And the fact is, he was basically saying, look, I mean, however else you feel about Ukraine and Belarus, the fact is these are border states for us. These are existential interests for us. And if you get aggressive, we are going to respond in kind. And he said that in a couple different ways. And of course, behind all this is the Russian nuclear doctrine, which is that if they are placed in a situation where their conventional military is in trouble, they will first resort to nuclear weapons. So he was outlining just how serious this situation is and just how dangerous it is. And unfortunately, the clowns in Washington don't seem to quite get it. Again, they don't seem to get back to understanding that we have a military to defend the country, not to take offensive action in 130 different countries. We have a military that's designed, or it should be designed, to support American interests when necessary. And we've gotten away from all that stuff. And Putin is basically, the old chess player Putin is laying out, what are essential interests and what have to be defended against countries like the United States, which are basically obsessed with this idea, as you mentioned before, this Messiah complex, that the United States is the fixer for the rest of the world, and the United States has a right to intervene everywhere. And Putin has very definitely denounced this concept many, many times, but he's making it very clear now because we're on the verge of a possible war.
The other thing that I scratch my head about is this sort of set of circumstances. You had the situation. First, you had the killer without a soul comment, to which Putin replied, "That is you, but what am I?" Which was a great comeback, misinterpreted for the U.S. But so you have the situation where he says this, and then he calls him up. Hey, Vlad, you want to get together? You want to have a summit? What do you think? And Vlad says, we'll think about it. And then 2 days later, he slaps on all of these sanctions on Russia, with additional threats on top of the sanctions. And he says he bases it all on this intelligence community assessment. And this seems to be a new product that we first saw previewed in early 2017, that is not something that we recognize as a normal intelligence community product. How do you untangle all of these seemingly weird things? Like, you don't call someone up and say, hey, let's have a summit, and then 2 days later you put a bunch of sanctions on them, unless you sort of believe your own rhetoric, unless you believe, and I think Gilbert Doctorow talked about this, we have to put our boot on their neck, so to speak, before we can talk because we have to come at them from a position of strength. What do you think about that?
Well, I think essentially what we're seeing is that the Doctrine concept there, which is the belief that since the United States is economically and militarily stronger than Russia and has allies to back it up, essentially, if we push hard enough, the Russians will back down. Now, I don't believe that's true, because the Russians are seeing these interests that they're protecting as existential. So I don't buy any of that. And one of the scary things to me was when they introduced these sanctions. These sanctions were introduced with kind of a little backstory that hey, we're expecting these sanctions to be really punishing, to go after the Russian banking and financial services system, and we will eventually destroy their economy. These were the noises coming out of Washington, from the various commentators and also from the government itself. Now this is scary stuff. This goes way beyond punishing a country because you don't like the fact that they have a dissident and the dissident is in jail, which is a lot of what we hear, or because Russia will take over, reconstitute as the Soviet Union somehow, which we all know is impossible and untrue. But these narratives keep getting trotted out, but the intention of this stuff is dead serious.
Yeah, that's economic warfare. That's openly declaring economic warfare. We're going to take down the ruble, and I think that was the most serious part that I saw in it. But what about, I know that you've been following this whole business about the Belarus coup, and I have many thoughts about it. But for our viewers who may not have been following it, there was a secret recording of 2 coup plotters, I think at least 2, meeting with their handlers. They didn't realize it was being recorded by Russian intelligence, but they talked about a spectacular coup that they were going to take off in Belarus, including the assassination of Lukashenko and his family. It sounds pretty fantastical. The suggestion was that the U.S. was definitely involved. On the one hand, let's let you take your take before I give mine, Phil.
Well, I hate to say it, but it smells to me like an actual U.S. intelligence operation. You have these 2 native language speakers, one of whom is an American citizen. You send them in, and it's kind of a scouting expedition. And they want to impress the guy who was a handler. I believe the handler was probably a Russian intelligence officer, although I'm not sure about that. And you basically you start the ball rolling. This model worked in 2014 in Ukraine, basically, although there were a lot of other elements in it too. Now, the only thing missing here is we don't have Victoria Nuland handing out cookies with John McCain in Minsk. But maybe that's coming too, although we'd have to revive you.
She's baking them as we speak.
So, I just see this as, it has all the marks of some dumbass in Washington coming up with this thing and figuring out this is how we're going to do it. It worked before, it'll work again.
I got a great idea.
So I think when Putin and Lukashenko are talking about this coup attempt as being something maybe a little on the serious side, I think they might have actually the evidence to back that up.
A couple of things strike me about this. First of all, they do have a mutual defense treaty, and if the U.S. fingerprints were on something like this, it's hard to believe that Russia would roll over. But the other thing, and this always seems to be the case, Phil, it's like an own goal, because the problem with Lukashenko, and as you know, he has been not been a very reliable partner. I mean, he likes to cozy up. There's a picture of him, I think it was last year, meeting with Pompeo. He likes to pretend that he's bigger on the world stage than he really is. And he likes to flirt with the U.S. Quite a bit. And this, if it was the U.S. behind it, and not a Russian operation to make it look like the U.S. was doing an operation, this absolutely, to me, sends a clear message to Lukashenko. You better stop. You better take a good hard look at your situation, take a good look at your geography, and you need to stop playing footsie with the West, because the West is your enemy. To me, at least, it sounds like that.
Well, Lukashenko, of course, has his own internal problems in terms of his re-election was by by no means clear and honest, and he does face a major kinds of tiredness of his regime, internally speaking. He's been arresting a lot of people, and there have been a lot of demonstrations. So he's kind of walking a tight wire to a certain extent. He has to understand that Russia has the strong hand, and that his overtures to the West are not necessarily going to bring him anything that he really needs or wants. What is he going to do? Start building Fiats in Minsk, or is he? What does he think is going to come down the road? Does he think that anyone beyond Joe Biden wants to, and Bill Clinton want him to enter NATO? What kind of asset will he be in NATO? The whole thing has kind of got a lot of wrinkles to it, and of course he's a pretty old man now.
Oh, poor guy.
And so I don't know. I kind of look at it and I think, well, it's this, and the Russians are certainly playing games, because that's why you have an intelligence service. The U.S. is, in my opinion, playing games also, and is thinking of ways to bring about something like regime change. The U.S. designated ambassador to Belarus has been meeting with the opposition, the Belarus opposition, up in Lithuania in the last few days. So there are a lot of kind of things going on around here.
Yeah, Lukashenko always reminded me of the kid brother who's always jealous that his older brother was a track star or something. We're getting short on time, but I have to bring something else up that I know you follow very closely, because you write about the Middle East a lot, and that is this apparent Syrian missile strike deep into Israel. Apparently last night, I believe, near the nuclear facility toward the southern part of the state. There's a lot of explanations. I don't see anything definitive right now. What is your view of what happened yesterday with this?
Okay, well, if you go back to the beginning of the story is that the Israelis, as they have been doing 2 or 3 times every week, staged an air raid against near Damascus. So in retaliation, for the first time, the Syrians fired back. They fired back with SA-5 Russian-made missile. Well, SA is surface to air, but they used it as a surface-to-ground missile in this case. It's old technology, although it's been updated and upgraded a bunch of times. But I think it was intended to not necessarily hit a target, because it's not that accurate, but it was fired at the Israeli nuclear development site at Dimona. And it got through the very expensive, that we Americans have paid for, Israeli defense systems, and it almost hit the target. And so I think it was intended as a warning. It's we just sent one of these over, but we have 1,500 more of them. And if you want them in volleys, we can arrange that too. So I think this was a kind of an upping of the ante. If all the bits of the story are correct, the Israelis are probably doing something in their pants at the moment, wondering how this thing got through, and they're downplaying it, of course, saying it was it was just a one-off, and well, of course, it's more serious than that. So again, this is another piece on the chessboard of what's going on in the Middle East. U.S. doesn't have any play in this one, except to wonder where all the money went for the air defenses, and So we shall see. I think the Israelis have to be very nervous about any kind of escalation that invites a major retaliation, either from Hezbollah or from Syria itself or from Iran. And I think we might see that playing out a bit in the Israeli media over the next few days.
And we have the Vienna talks, which apparently aren't falling apart, let's say at the least. And we have the rare rebuke from Biden, surprisingly, to Israel, that came a few days ago, saying, "Hey, you guys are making it difficult for us, by doing all this stuff we're trying to deal with Iran." So all those, I think, are a factor as well. But it seems like even the Israelis have the it's in their best interest to say, well, they were trying to shoot down a plane that was about to bomb outside of Damascus. But it seems like when you're off by that much, seems like, I mean, I wonder what, yeah, I mean, seems like a lot to be off.
Yeah, I think it was a deliberate targeting.
Yeah.
They weren't going to hit the plane with an SA-5, but it's got to land somewhere. And if you calculate it right, and it's close to a very sensitive Israeli installation, then of course it sends a message.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, Phil, thanks so much for spending the time and sharing your expertise with us. It's always great talking to you. We probably could go on for a couple more hours, but best wishes to you, and thanks again. And also to our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in to the Ron Paul Liberty Report.